Hello, my name is Afi Rule. I wear what I make, and I can teach you how to wear what you make. In today's sewing talk, I want to talk to you about sewing patterns. Specifically, I want to give you some food for thought when comparing digital and print sewing patterns so that you can determine which format might work best for you in your sewing journey right now. Let's dive right in, shall we? So let's start off by talking about print sewing patterns. I want to talk about pros and cons. And the first con that comes with physical sewing patterns is that you get one file per purchase, which is usually going to be however many pieces, however many pattern pieces that come with the entire pattern package. They're going to be assembled on 1, 2, or 3 large sheets of paper, very large sheets of paper. And that's great. But once you cut into the pattern, you cut it according to the size where you are at the moment. And we all know that our weight fluctuates. So you cut it, at one size, but then a couple of months you're a different size and you need a new pattern. So actually, I would like to know from those of you who use print patterns, what's your hack for this con? Because I personally don't have one other than to buy another print sewing pattern from the person who sold it to me. So let me know what you think. So the second con that comes from working with print sewing patterns is that there's a wait time from when you actually receive the pattern because they have to physically deliver it to you. That could be as few as a couple of days because, if you buy it off, say, like Amazon and you have Prime, sometimes you can get it same day. Sometimes it takes maybe a day or two. But if you're working with a company where it takes them a longer time to get it to you because of whatever shipping methods they use or whatever carrier they use, you're going to be waiting sometimes upwards of a week to receive your actual pattern. So the third con to working with print sewing patterns is that storage is required unless you figure out a way to digitize that sewing pattern and store it digitally. But if you do not do that, you have to store the pattern. That takes up space depending on how many patterns you have. And if you don't have a way to store it neatly and concisely, it can get pretty disorganized pretty quickly. So the last con that I have when working with print sewing patterns is that the price is usually higher. And that's because the costs to the manufacturer or the designer who sold it to you are higher. They have to print the pattern, they have to package it, they have to deliver it to you. And all of those things are going to factor into the price that you are going to pay for that print product. So now let's talk about some pros to your print sewing patterns. The first pro that I have is that it's already printed. And so that's in comparison to a digital sewing pattern where you have to print and assemble it. And I'm thinking more multiple page digital format. So if it's already printed, you don't have to do that. You just take the sheets out and cut out the individual pattern pieces that you need, but you don't have to go through the hassle of assembling a pattern or sending off a large digital format off to the printer. So the second pro that I have for working with print sewing patterns is that no assembly is required. And that actually is more geared towards multiple page PDF digital formats. You do have to print and assemble them, like I was saying before. So you don't have to assemble printed sewing patterns when you receive them from whatever designer you purchase them from. You're just going to have to figure out which pattern pieces you need from the printed sheets that come inside of the package. And the third pro, I put it as a pro because it's an option that you have, is that you can digitize your print sewing patterns. There's a plethora of tutorials on how to do that. I won't get into that here, but if you prefer to buy print sewing patterns, you can do that instead of just storing them physically. So now let's talk about digital format sewing patterns. Again, let's start with the cons. So the first con that I have with digital sewing patterns is that printing is required. You have to have your own home printer, paper, ink cartridges cost money, and they're actually pretty pricey for home printers. They are for everybody else too, but when you're buying them out of pocket instead of going to work, they're pretty pricey, right? But you do have to print it out. That is the first con. You have to use your own resources to print it out. The second con is that assembly is required. Although I feel like this isn't really a con if you have the skill set. The first one isn't really a con if you have the resources, but both of these are cons if you don't have the skill set or the resources. So going back to con number two, you have to have the skill set to know how to assemble it. If you don't, you will wind up with a skewed pattern. You have a skewed pattern, you will wind up with a wonky or skewed garment. Patterns are kind of like the building blocks for making your garment. And so if you don't know how to properly print a digital multiple page format pattern, you're going to struggle with making a quality garment. So the third con and final con for digital print sewing patterns is actually a spinoff of the second con, is that you are responsible for ensuring that the pattern prints properly. What do I mean by that? You have to make sure that your printer is set up to the right dimensions and settings to ensure that what the designer gave you is actually what you are printing. Things can get lost in translation if you don't know how to do that. I started including how to do this inside of my digital sewing pattern and where would you make digital sewing pattern packages, because I want to make sure that you're getting what that you're printing what I'm giving you. So if you don't have that skill set, it's definitely a con, and you could wind up with a wonky sewing pattern. So now let's move on to the pros of digital sewing patterns. The first pro is that you can print your digital file as many times as you want. Like I was saying before with print files, our weight fluctuates, our bodies change, our sizes change. And it's nice to know that even if it's not a weight fluctuation, it's nice to know that for whatever reason, you can just reprint your sewing pattern if you need to, instead of buying another pattern. So the second pro is that the price is usually lower with digital sewing patterns. Why? Because the costs that are associated with making them are different. You're not paying for shipping. You're not paying for the company to print it and then ship it to you. You're not paying for physical packaging. You're really just paying for the value and the other means of distribution that the designer used to give you the sewing pattern. That's also a definite plus. So the third pro is that it is available immediately upon purchase. As long as you download it, whenever you download it, it is available to you immediately. So the fourth pro and final pro that I have for sewing patterns, digital format sewing patterns, is that storage is optional. Meaning if you choose after you've assembled the pattern that you don't want to store it physically, you can dispose of it and just simply print it again when you're ready to use it. Now, the flip side to that is that if you're trying to conserve resources, like, you don't like wasting paper, you don't want to reprint and use up your ink toner cartridges and things like that, that could be a definite downfall to that. But if you're not worried about that, you can simply just dispose of the pattern that you have and just print it again. That way you don't have to worry about how to physically store it. those are all of the pros and cons that I have for working with both print and digital sewing patterns. If you have any, if you think I missed any, make sure that you leave me a comment below. That's what this is for. This is all about learning how to wear what you make, and learning about sewing patterns is definitely part of that. So this talk was inspired by me learning Adobe Illustrator for the very first time, and learning it for the specific and express purpose of creating digital sewing patterns. So I am proud to say that we now have our first 2 sewing patterns up and running for the Wear What You Make community. If you are not a part, just make sure that you go to join.wearwhatyoumake.com and you can join there. All of our sewing pattern packages come with sew-alongs, instructions on how to get your printer ready and up and running like we were talking about before, and also how to print and assemble your sewing patterns. And then again, the sew along takes you through step by step how to make the actual item. So this is actually one of the this is one of our patterns. This is one of our projects. It is our sun hat. It is up and running. I'm so excited. This is for spring and summer. This is one variation. It's a little more like a bucket hat with the short brim, but hey, you know, you can, this is just one variation of the hat. So again, I am super excited. Just come on and join us, and I will see you soon. All right. Bye.